Okay, this is Business 342, the practice final set 1, problem number 1. Okay, it says, what do you know for certain, really important there, for certain about two mutually exclusive projects? Remember, mutually exclusive means you can only do one or the other. You don't have the finances to do both. So you've got to choose between the two projects, mutually exclusive. It says, what do you know for certain about two mutually exclusive projects if their net present values both plot exactly at the crossover point? So if their NPVs both plot exactly at the crossover point on an MVP net present value profile graph. Okay, so let's go over what a crossover point is in a net present value profile graph. And here is one of two mutually exclusive projects. Okay, and basically it's project A and project B. You can see up here. And here's period 0, which would be your initial investment. Period 1 and period 2, the cash flows in. Tells you what your internal rate of return is. Remember, the internal rate of return is the rate of return at which your net present value equals 0. And then it shows your net present value. Remember, the net present value is taking a required return rate, say for instance 10%, and you discount the future cash flows at that 10% to get the present value of them. And then you take the present value of those cash flows, you minus the initial investment, and you either have a positive net present value, a negative net present value, or 0 for net present value. So it's the present value of those future cash flows discounted at a required return rate or a discount rate minus the initial investment, get you your net present value. Okay, so this shows the net present value profile graphs for A and B, two mutually exclusive investments, which means you can only do one or the other. And it shows that the crossover point is where the two, like I say, cross over, where their net present values equal each other. At this point, here's the net present values. 0 is right here. This is negative. At this point, their net present values equal each other at the crossover point. And let's just show you really quickly how to figure out the crossover point. And the way you do that is you take the difference between the two projects, A and B, and then you find out what the internal rate of return is, which is the rate that just makes them 0. The rate that makes the present value of those 0. So in this case, the difference, the delta between A and B, is negative 100 right here. It's 0. And for all periods, you do this the cash flows, because this is a cash flow too. It's your initial investment. It's negative because it comes out of your pocket. And this is 125. Okay, so that's the delta of these. Okay, so you want to find out the IRR, the internal rate of return, that makes those 0. So we'll take our calculator, turn it on, cleared cash flow, second CE, because you want to, I don't know if you couldn't see that, but there was some old numbers on there. Okay, so I pushed cash flow, then second CE cleared it, and now CE, so you want to put in the cash flows. So the first cash flow delta, and you want to find out the IRR for the delta between the two. So negative 100, 100, negative, enter, arrow down, and that's just for one period. I mean, that's just the initial cash flow. Okay, so for period 1, the difference between the two was 0. Okay, so you got to enter 0, arrow down, you got to enter 1. Okay, and then it's 200 for the second period. Excuse me, it's 125 for the second period. 125 is the delta, enter, down, enter, down. Okay, so now what you want to find is the internal rate of return, the rate of return that makes these 0. That'll be the crossover point. Okay, So you hit the IRR key. Remember, it's showing 0 right now. You got to hit compute. So 11.8% is the crossover point. So you took the delta between these two, all the cash flows, including the initial investment. So all three cash flows, you took the delta, you entered those in. This was CFO, CO1, CO2. You put those in, and it says that 11.8% is the crossover point. And if you look, this is 10%, 0.1. 11.8% is the crossover point. So that's the point at which the net present values equal each other. Okay? So let's go back to the question, what they were asking. And I'll zoom this in a little bit. Okay, what do you know for certain about two mutually exclusive projects if their net present values both plot exactly at the crossover point? So that means their net present values plot exactly the same, which means they're the same at the crossover point on a net present value profile graph. Okay, so let's look at this again. And so the first thing, are both projects have a zero net present value? Well, not necessarily. In this case, they don't have a 0 net present value. They could have a positive net present value. It could have a 0 net present value. It could have a negative net present value. These things could cross over down here. These could cross over at 0. So that's not one of the answers, obviously. Neither project is acceptable. Well, how can you tell from that? Because they don't tell you what the net present value is. Remember, if the net present value is 0, that means that you meet exactly your present value of your future cash flows equal exactly what you're discounted at the required return rate, equal exactly what your initial investment is. So that 0 makes the net present value 0, but means it's an acceptable project because you're getting at least the required return rate. If it's positive, it means you're getting above the required return rate. And if it's negative, you're getting below the required return rate, so you wouldn't accept it. So you don't know whether it's acceptable or not because they don't tell you what the net present value. This is a graph that has nothing to do with this problem. So this graph happens to be positive, but this is just a graph that I grabbed, so don't base it on this. They give us no numbers here. You can't figure out what the net present value is on this. C, both projects should be accepted. Well, if you can't, it says neither project should be accepted, both projects should be accepted. You can't tell because you just don't have the numbers. You just know that their net present values are the same because at the crossover point, that's what happens. And then lastly, you are indifferent between the two projects. Well, if you're evaluating them through net present value, which remember, out of all the different ways you can do it, payback period, internal rate of return, different ways to the profitability index, that net present value is the best way to evaluate whether you should accept a project. It's better than IRR, the internal rate of return. Those are the two best, but net present value is the best way to select it. So in this case, it says you are indifferent between the two projects. Well, if their net present values both plot exactly at the crossover point, which means they're both at the same point, okay, in this case, because they use crossover point. They could have just said that they didn't have to use crossover point, but they did in this case. Okay, so if their net present values both exactly plot at the crossover point, that means they're both the same. And if their net present values are both the same, that means you would be indifferent to which one you selected, right? Because in this case, say it's $60. If they're both at $60, then if you're basing it on net present value, you'd kind of be indifferent to which one you selected. So that the answer to this one is D. Okay, so that is Business 342, Practice Final, Set 1, Problem number 1. And these are, I'm enclosing these pages. I'm going to send you this information so you have this stuff to take a look at.